SD. There's only a few evidence.
Hello, welcome back to a live broadcast here on KTAL LP, Las Cruces, New Mexico. We're at 101.5 on your FM dial, and we're streamed live lccommunityradio.org. This program is Science Let's Take a Look, and I'm your host, Vince Gutschick. My guest today in the studio is Clay Doyle, who is the Vice President for Transmission and Distribution at El Paso Electric. Let me make sure your mic is up. Let's check.
Good afternoon.
I think that's working.
Great.
All right. So, Clay, introduce yourself so people know who you are.
Okay. My name is Clay Doyle. I'm the Vice President of Transmission and Distribution for El Paso Electric Company. I've been in Las Cruces, a native New Mexican. Graduated in '83 with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, and then in '88 with a master's degree in electrical engineering. I've been with El Paso Electric Company since 1992.
When's the last time you did a Laplace transform?
Back in 1985 or 6.
So I can't use one of my favorite math jokes. We'll skip that for now.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, right. So we're talking about, I guess I chose the topic, the electric grid. Now, I've heard that described as the biggest machine in the world. Everything's spinning in sync there.
Yes, that's correct. I've heard the same thing. And the connotation is the largest man-made machine ever built.
Right, yeah.
Right.
What keeps it going? I mean, you got the individual generators, and people like you and your staff are responsible for keeping that going. How does it all get tied together? I was trying to research that on the web, and it drove me nuts.
Yeah, so the way the grid evolved, it started off, between Edison and Tesla back in the late 1800s, and Tesla eventually prevailed with an alternating current model for the way we can produce, transmit, and use electricity. And it started with small generators in small areas, and then somebody discovered that if you tied these generators together, you can get more use out of them. You can help back each other up, and so the grid kind of started growing, kind of organic, kind of kept growing as more demand and more use happened to get to where we are today, where we have thousands and thousands of synchronous generators pumping into a transmission system, and then you get the notion of how grids work. And so I guess we can explore that a little bit if you want to.
Yeah, well, one thing that just bugs me on a technical point is I remember when our Kiwanis Club visited El Paso Electric, which was a mind-opening experience, that you say, okay, you get penalties if your frequency drops and so on, but if your frequency isn't exactly in sync with another member of the grid, how do you match that?
Okay, so the way synchronous generators work is everything has to be synchronized, and so let's start with the grid, how the grid works. So the continental United States, or continental North America in general, is divided into three grids. Okay, there's the western grid, and there's the eastern grid, and then there's the ERCOT grid, because Texas always thought that they were their own nation and still want to believe they are, and so they have their own grid. The western grid connects through transmission lines all the generators starting in New Mexico going west to the west coast, the Baja California, Mexico, and up into British Columbia. So all of the generators that are on this side of that range, are synchronous condensers, and they're tied to each other through transmission lines at substations through transmission lines. And the nature of synchronous generators is they have to be in sync. They're rotating at the same speed. They're rotating at 3,600 RPMs per minute. That's equivalent to 60 cycles per second, and they're all tied together. And when you get to the East Coast, the East Grid is the same thing. It's the same connection of generators through transmission lines, and that grid is also functioning at 3,600 RPM, 60 cycles. The difference is, and I like to use analogies because it makes things simple for me, is that everything is spinning together on the western grid. Every generator is spinning at the same exact synchronous time. And the western grid, all of the generators are spinning at the same exact synchronous time. The difference is that the eastern grid and the western grid are disconnected in that they're, even though they're spinning at the same speed, it's almost like thinking the sprockets of a bicycle are not lined up. So I can't move energy from one grid to the next grid without having an exchange to resynchronize it. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, here's the question.
Okay.
Like, I remember you said, okay, you get a penalty if the frequency drops because you can't meet the demand.
Correct.
Okay, does that mean everybody on the grid starts dropping and you're responsible, so you have to cut out if you can't
Correct.
match it?
So the American standard is 60 cycles per second. So that's the frequency and that's the synchronous speed of the generators. So what happens is if you've got a bunch of generators, and let's just take our area as an example, is our area we have a certain number of generators that are running all the time. At any one time, instant in time, electric generation and electric demand have to equal each other. Well, if there's a disturbance in the system and let's say you have the loss of a generator or you have an additional big load come on.
Like you said, Super Bowl.
Like Super Bowl.
The
right?
ads come on and everybody...
Yeah, right. The ads come on. Everybody
well, that's the water utility that really gets hit.
Right. And so what happens is when you don't have enough generation and you have load, then frequency wants to slow down. It's kind of like adding a big load to your vehicle and you expect to go 60 miles an hour down the freeway, and all of a sudden somebody drops a big load on your truck that you're driving down the road. Well, the speed is going to want to slow down. Same thing happens with generators. A lot of load comes on, or if one of the generators, one of the motors goes out, well, all of a sudden the frequency, the speed is going to want to slow down. Well, the American standard is you can't have that. That creates a bunch of problems. So what you're required as a utility to do is you're required to either mitigate the problem, fix it immediately, or you have to dump load and get back to synchronism.
And people don't like that.
And that's not a popular choice.
Right. How often do you have to drop load?
That is a rare event. We all utilities strive to maintain levels of reliability, and it's a very infrequent event that we have to drop load. I think the last time that we had to go through a load shed was probably late January, February of 2011 when we had the big freeze.
I remember that one.
Right.
And actually, I don't have a bad memory of that because we were on the same area as Memorial Medical, so we had power.
Correct. And so that was an unusual, very unusual case. Is that we had this unexpected freeze that we lost almost all of our local generation due to freezing of pipes and instrumentation specifically. And I think we had one or two local generators running out of maybe 10. And we had our transmission lines that we were able to import power, but we get to a point where we have to keep a load balance. And we also, every utility has to plan for a contingency problem. So the way it operates in the Western Grid or the Western Electric Coordinating Council is that we have to maintain the ability to lose our largest generator or our largest transmission line and not blink your lights. Okay,
that's incredible to me.
Correct, and so we have to keep some what we call spinning reserve. We have to keep some generation online that is rotating but not loaded, so that if we lose a generator or if we lose a transmission line, that generation can automatically pick up the load. In the case with the freeze of 2011, we didn't have the local generation, so we had to depend on our imports and our one. I think there might have been two generators that were running at the time locally, and so we had a load limit. When we got to a load limit in the evening, when everybody came home and wanted to cook dinner and they wanted to have the lights on the TV, then we had to go through a load shedding because we had to keep it at a certain level that we could pick up.
Yeah, well, I remember when we were visiting, you said, we're not selling energy, we're selling power. it has to be on demand, on time, at the right rate.
Correct.
Yeah. That involves a lot of people to keep that going. How many people does El Paso Electric have?
I think as a company, we're standing right now at about 1,100 employees
Okay.
total.
Yeah. And they all have different responsibilities. It's rather mind-boggling to have seen your plant and say, how do you keep this all going and meet, financial obligations and the obligations of just the energy supply and all the legal obligations. I remember you talked about how you can trade energy, but one side can't know, but the other side, something about prices. Is that right?
So yeah, there's a marketing side of the company, and then there's the operations side of the company. I've always been on the operating side of the company. I've always been in transmission and distribution, in the wires side we call it. And the other two divisions of the operating side of an electric utility are, of course, generation, which a lot of utilities still have generation. Some of them have spun off and they're divested, but we have generation, and then we have the marketing and power exchange part of the company. And so what we are doing as a utility, and every utility does this, is it's kind of like a energy stock exchange.
Right.
People are always watching what the price of energy is and where you have the opportunity to sell energy to your neighbors or receive energy from your neighbors at a cheaper cost than you can purchase it. I'm not real familiar with that side of the house and how that functions, so I don't want to guess on how that works. I'm sure I would be wrong about the details, except to say that we are buying and selling energy all the time with our neighbors.
Minute by minute or what?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, minute by minute.
Yeah, that's something that people don't realize. You could think of your little household, gasoline fuel generator. Yeah, I could keep that going. Oh, well, I ran out of fuel, The reliability level on that would be pretty low. But even if you were watching it like a hawk, it's nothing like saying, I've got to be trading energy all around the grid just to make sure that I can keep everybody's lights at the right level.
Correct. It's an interesting, I think we discussed when you came to visit, and we look at we have a big board. We have a big control center where we look at it's a big board that shows all of our generation at one time.
It's like a movie set.
Yeah, and it shows all our load and what what electric flow is from one substation to the other, from one generation, what every generator is contributing, whether it's solar or it's a natural gas peaker, or we're buying it, through one of the exchanges. So the way it works as a member of the grid, we have our own control area. We have an area that we serve is between Hatch, New Mexico, and Van Horn, Texas. It's about 10,000 square miles. We have about a little over 400,000 customers. And we are interconnected to the north with, directly interconnected to the north with P&M out of Albuquerque.
Right.
And we are connected to the west with Tucson Electric. And then we are also connected on the western grid. We are connected to Tri-State, which is a generation and transmission company.
Okay.
And then to the east, that's when you get into the other grid. When you get to Artesia and the eastern side of the state, Clovis, Portales, that whole area is on the eastern grid, and we interconnect there with what used to be Southwestern Public Service Company, and is now Exxon. No, what's it? XL Energy, right. Thank you. And we are tied there through an AC-DC tie. Okay. So if you remember in our discussions, we have different grids, and they're both spinning at synchronous speed, but they're not synchronized with each other. And so if I want to move energy from our grid, western grid, to the eastern grid, or the eastern grid to our grid, we have to go through, we convert it from AC at their synchronous speed to DC energy, and then back to AC at our synchronous, that's synchronized with us. So it's an AC-DC tie.
And that's a big motor generator set, basically.
It's actually like we have the older technology. It's a silicon controlled rectifiers, SCRs.
Yeah.
That does a lot of switching in there.
Okay.
Yeah. So
it's like a switching power supply.
Yeah, it is.
Then.
That's exactly what it is.
Okay, so it's not spinning motors.
No, it's not.
Okay, good.
And so, anyways, So with this interconnection, the way it works is that we're looking at our load all the time, and P&M to the north of us looking at their load all the time, and so is Tucson. And so if we're always pushing and pulling on each other.
Right.
So we can talk about. Do you need to take a break? Or?
Well, I just want to do a station ID and then
Okay.
do
We can come back to this.
a little pitch here. So you're listening to KTAL, KTAL LP FM, Las Cruces, New Mexico. We're at 101.5 on the dial, and we're streamed live at lccommunityradio.org. Clay Doyle, Vice President for Transmission and Distribution at El Paso Electric, is my guest. But let me tell you about some other things that are very relevant to keeping this